Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. We now turn to the World Economic Forum 2019, which starts Tuesday next week in Davos, Switzerland. The 5-day annual meeting brings together 3,000 leaders from businesses, government, civil society, academia, media, the arts and culture, as well as global experts and young leaders. In its latest report on Wednesday, though, the Davos World Economic Forum warned the world is facing a global growing number of complex and interconnected challenges, from slowing global growth and persistent economic inequality to climate change and geopolitical tensions. The theme for 2019 is Globalization 4.0, shaping a global architecture in the age of the fourth industrial revolution. For more on the World Economic Forum and its report on the global risk forecast, we are joined in the UK by Mike Bastin, a visiting professor at Beijing's University of International Business and Economics in Washington, D.C. We have Jeffrey Schott, who's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and with us in Beijing, Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Three gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to start with you, Mr. Schott. Do you think now, with ever complex situations, those between big players in the world, will geopolitics hijack the agenda in which discussions of economic issues are actually extremely important these days?
It doesn't hijack the discussions, but it emphasizes how important it is for the leading economies of the world to work together. Not necessarily with the same priorities, but to cooperate to ensure that both their own national economies and the world economy gets on a stronger footing. And right now we have a number of risks, as pointed out in the World Economic Forum report.
The question is, with different directions of concerns and the end goals, will people be able to join together to deal with the same problems, even though they might look differently in their different priorities? Professor Liu, briefly.
Well, I think it's a disappointing situation where when the world economy is just managing on the recovery track, and right now there is quite a growing divergence among the consensus that is really managed before towards those very key issues like the climate change, like the shared platform for global trade and investment. So I think that it is very timely that they raise the alarm and the report thoroughly analyze the situation. So do we really now share a consensus over those key issues that impact not only the biggest powers, but also the whole world?
Everybody. If you look at the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, released a top 10 of likely risks. Take a look at them. Climate change related risks, like extreme weather, were among the top 3 greatest threats. Data fraud, cyber warfare came in 4th and 5th. Other environmental risks like ecosystem collapse and water security also rounded out the ranking. A lot of the crucial issues over there, but those issues, we have been talking about them for quite some time. Professor Bastin, unlikely it seems we are going to find the final answer this time at the World Economic Forum. But what does it say also? That we've been discussing for years, not just at the World Economic Forum, but globally on various occasions, but we do not yet have the guts to work together. That's sad.
What it is, it's the most disappointing finding in the report, that there are growing, increasingly complex issues. You know, obviously environmental change is right there at the top, and rising sea levels, urbanization, the financial system. Right. But there's very little collective will to tackle them. Nationalism's on the rise. The phrase they use in the report, taking back control, seems to resonate with many, many people across many countries, particularly in the UK and the US. So that collective will and wanting to work together really is the major issue underpinning this report and the way forward, and there's not a lot of optimism out there at the moment.
Mr. Shaw, you agree with that?
Not very much optimism on many fronts, though increasing recognition that countries still have to act to avoid much greater risk going forward.
Right.
And it's not just the governments that have to act, it's the private sectors that have to act as well.
But Mr. Shaw, you know, the reason why we gather together, the four of us, is not having a pessimistic discussion. The reason why we're gathering here, we're trying to find some solutions, if possible, in our own way, right? If just a little contribution we can make, that would be already wonderful. So, Mr. Shaw, given the fact that you're an economist and you've been doing a lot of fair research about economies around the world, what do you think are some of the key threats, once we pull them, we're likely to be able to tackle many of the challenges as mentioned, about where shall we begin with, and how little effort, small effort even at the very beginning we can make together at least, we can really go somewhere. Mr. Shaw, what is that for you?
Well, I've worked a lot on the trading system.
Absolutely.
And on climate change over the years, and energy cooperation. We're failing in both areas. The World Trade Organization is in crisis, and the leading countries of the world, the leading trading nations, have to be able to work together. And we're not seeing that. Trade relations between the two largest countries, the United States and China, are much worse than they were a year ago, though there was a constructive turn at the G20 summit, leading to new negotiations that hopefully will yield some fruit and prevent an erosion, further erosion of our bilateral trade relations. But we need to also work together to shore up the World Trade Organization, deal with the crisis of dispute settlement in that organization, and the need for updating the rule book, which has basically not been touched since 1995 when the WTO entered into force.
Of course.
That's a big problem.
That is a big issue, but
the other problem is climate change, and that requires... Yeah.
Go ahead, sir. Sorry.
I'm sorry. The other problem is climate change, and that requires a sustained long-term effort. The Paris Agreement is designed to coordinate the individual efforts of individual countries. The United States, the current administration, is not playing its part.
Professor Liu, you can see very clearly through the answers of the three of you, it is not the issues that are paramount, and therefore there's pessimism in the air, but rather the pessimism is in the air because of lack of coordination, lack of the spirit of cooperation, and lack of the actions of working together. Professor Liu, of course there is the issue of trust.
That's right.
There's the issue of how should we come to terms with the common ground that we at least have. Professor Liu,
yes.
Will we be able to do that? What is preventing us from doing it?
I think it's a basic reflection of the reality, and do we share the same planet? And how are we really contributing to the climate change issues and to solve certain imperative problems? Number two is that, okay, the basic economics. Can the trade and investment freer combination of all economic resources yield a better result for everybody? And then also that how stronger economies, stronger powers can really give more preferential treatment to those lesser developed economies. So these are really the basic ideology and basic humanity. And on those bases, we can really find ways to coordinate and also to generate better results.
Professor Bastin, Earlier in my interview with the Chinese ambassador Cui Tiankai to the United States, I also asked him a very similar question that some people have describing the time that we are in right now pretty different. Let's just say from 30 years ago, you know, during when China was entering into the WTO and things like that. And there seems to be more of looking inward for a lot of countries around the world and not necessarily having the interests and also the guts to look around and even beyond. But Professor Bastian, will that be the characteristics of our time? How can we, even though they sound abstract, but still make this a big time rather than a very small inward-looking time? Can we be able to do something?
Certainly in the longer term, yes. I mean, the short-term view is really rather negative, and we have certain leaders around the world, obviously in America, where there's a lot of negativity attached there. But certainly things can change, and things can change very, very quickly if we have 2 or 3 world leaders who take a more liberal stance, a more cooperative, working together attitude, then things can change. It has to be said, though, there's a lot of nationalism on the rise. And I think what underpins this, what's really gone wrong here, is that people assume globalization and the free market is some sort of ready-made model, fixed model that just works, when the fact is it doesn't. There's increasing inequality, massive inequality between urban and rural, across regions, across countries, and that's really what needs to be addressed. And we need to really look very, very closely. Your American panelists talked about updating the rule book. We need to update our mindsets. We need to throw out GDP and welcome gross national happiness, well-being, a completely rethink of what life is about and what progress means. And it's not about making money and becoming materially better off, and which leads to the rich getting richer and this massive inequality. So a rethink, well-being, gross national happiness is the way forward, and we need leaders to actually take that on board.
Well, we can see there are 3 compassionate gentlemen that are talking to us today, you know, but we still want to combine not only idealism but pragmatism as well, and particularly recently if you look at the stories on the headline. So Mr. Schott, pragmatically speaking, even one small step that is on the encouraging side could help the rest of the world realize there's really something that we can do together. So if the trade mechanism, if we talk about the whole mechanism to reform, is going to be very difficult just within a short period of time, what at least could be the starting point? That is very crucial. We have to start somewhere. That is the wisdom that we need to have.
Well, the simple fact is that we have to learn from our mistakes. And the recent trade war between the United States and China has shown not only the cost to both countries, but to many other countries that are getting collateral damage from the tariffs that have been imposed on bilateral U.S.-China trade. So the first step is to find a solution to the current U.S.-China disputes so that both our countries can take the required leadership role in designing both bilateral, regional, and multilateral solutions to the problems in the trading system and to dealing with the development challenges faced by most of the world's trading nations. That has to start with an element of trust and cooperation between the 2 largest countries. We have lost that, and hopefully we're beginning to recoup some of that in the talks that are occurring now and will continue in Washington, hopefully at the end of this month.
We do know now Chinese Vice Premier Liu He is going to Washington at the end of January, of course. Professor Liu, though, it will be very convenient. Any country or any 2 countries that have problems in their bilateral relations, they can just stand up and they go. However, that is the most irresponsible attitude, one would say. And in this case, if it is between China and the United States, which is the first and the second largest economies in the world, that would be extremely irresponsible.
That's true.
So what is at least at the very beginning of these responsible steps? Are you seeing signs of it?
I think now, to shift from a transactional approach into a more relational approach and a more responsible manner for both of those economies and consumers and business community at large is the right beginning. And right now, let's recognize some of the existing problems and try to bridge the gap, at least in acknowledgement of certain issues that are outstanding. And then, how we can really strategize to iron out those differences while we can really be able to move forward and leave certain outstanding issues to be tackled with time and also with changes of events. So we cannot really solve the problem that is accumulated for 4 decades or even longer period of time overnight, and also tolerate the difference and the different ways of managing each country's economy, each country's society is also the foundation.
I see. On the other hand, you do see other issues, for example, environmental issues, climate change issues. All of you have been beautifully illustrating earlier, but there's another thing of the tech gap. When we are saying about the fourth industrial revolution, it's a wonderful phrase, but it is more than clear that this gap is getting ever bigger among economies. And there will be even more people be disillusioned of this round of globalization if it is about a technological gap. So, Mr. Schott, inside the U.S. too, and also between countries, among countries as well, about that, your thought?
I think it's less a concern about the technological gap because technology is advancing so rapidly, but rather more about the increasing technological competition. And that's the root of a lot of friction between the major trading countries, both with the appropriation of the technology, the licensing of the technology, and the diffusion of that technology, and also the theft of that technology, the misappropriation. That's been an increasingly difficult problem because the advances in technology are outrunning the ability to enforce existing rules of commerce, and that's an area where I think the commercial and the security realms are overlapping and causing the bigger political strains.
That is really the issue, isn't it, Professor Bastian? If you look at the tech issue, the economy issue, and the geopolitics, they are ever more further intertwined with one another, and that is the complexity of it. Professor?
Yes, it is. So it requires cooperation across a large number of countries, larger and larger number of countries, even more. And one thing I would say is that we need to see an increased status, role, importance, lead taken by the G20, not the G8. I think the G8 is very much outdated. The G20, the 20 largest nations, is far more reflective of the changes in the world economy. There are more countries. It's going to create an atmosphere, a culture of cooperation. And really those global institutions, such as the WTO, the IMF, they're outdated as well. They need to be revised, maybe renamed, and they need to take their lead from the G20, not the G8. I think that will be a massive step forwards in terms of a culture of cooperation globally.
What will be the key of it? The genuine attitude or the platform on which the discussions are likely to take place, or something else? Professor Liu, before we go.
I think, first of all, a shared value foundation, and then to be followed by an optimistic attitude and a collaborative, inclusive attitude, and then you really devise ways to work forward for the benefit of all stakeholders involved.
Sounds abstract, but we hope that can be implemented. And Mr. Schott, final words before we go.
Well, I think you've been pushing us for practical solutions. And the G20 isn't a good body for actually implementing things. It's a good talk shop. But in terms of practical solutions on the technological side, the United States and China had a very introductory agreement in September of 2015 on cyber issues. That did not fulfill its promise. It needs to be revisited and updated, augmented, and that's something that I think President Trump and President Xi Jinping should be able to work together on, given the trust that they have and the personal relationship they've built up over the past 2 years.
All right.
That would be a very significant step forward if we could develop a new bilateral cyber initiative.
Coming from different parts of the world with different priorities in mind, the three gentlemen with us certainly has helped us to understand how complex actually the issues facing us today. Thank you so much for the three of you, Mike Baston, Jeffrey Schott, and Liu Baocheng. Thanks. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.